Alright, I think I butchered my port timing 101 video and made it way longer than I needed to. But if you watch it and have more specific questions, I made a Gmail account. I'm going to put it in the video description and under my, my channel description. SuperDaveOutdoors@gmail.com is the channel name at gmail.com. Hey everybody, this is my shot at explaining port timing to someone that's just getting into hot rodding saws, or someone that's been toying with it a little bit but hadn't really put any thought into how the ports relate, or don't may not be exactly clear on what they do and how moving the numbers around changes things. I guess your first thing you need to know is what is the port timing. It's the relation of all your ports to top dead center. The highest point the piston travels. And this is just an example cylinder. It's kind of dirty, but the highest point piston travels. You need to know height of the exhaust, which is that port there. Where the transfers land. Typically, you time this in degrees. There's also people that time them with port heights. So that's just measuring the top of that port to the top of your combustion or the bottom of your combustion chamber, where your squish band would be. And this one needs run a real narrow band and then have a taper, like a secondary band into the chamber. So it'd be like measuring where this port is down to here. You're getting essentially the same thing. The whole reason you're measuring it is really to get a repeatable result, or track what changes you've made inside that cylinder, and take notes as far as hey, I changed my intake and then now my saw does this, or I changed the transfers but now power comes on at a different RPM range. So you can I typically I haven't messed with port heights at all. As far as I know, some builders do. I don't. It's not very common. The most common way is timing by top dead center, where you find 0 and then everything is pretty much 180 to 180 degrees from there. And then bottom dead center is, once you go from 179, you hit 0 again, and then you come back to 180. It just goes one way and then goes the other, back up. Once you have your set of numbers, it's going to look something like this. And this is in relation to top dead center. My intake closes at 72 degrees. Transfers open at 127 and 132. This is after top dead center. That's going to be after bottom dead center, I think. Don't remember. But anyway, I use the digital degree wheel, so it's going to hit 72 and then you crank it back around and it's going to close at 72 when you time it. But 72 degrees on the intake, 127, 132 is when my transfers are opening. That's, it might be the same on both rotations. Actually, some of them are not, because like in Echo 680, has an offset wrist pin in the piston, so on your way up it's probably going to be a little bit different than on your way down, I think. Whatever, that's too far in depth. But anyway, this is what your numbers are going to look like: 72, 127, 132, 109 on the exhaust. That's just the stock timing numbers on a 4910. Now from there, if we'll start with what they do. Your intake, I've seen them from 63 to 82 degrees on stuff I've messed with. More's not always better, less is not always better. This one is a real balance. This is probably the last one I mess with after I've ported something. If you have too much intake, it makes the saw lazy, like it'll kind of bog off the throttle, and then it'll take off. It'll just go brr, wow, and then just take off. So too much delays throttle response. If it's too little, it'll restrict performance. Haven't really run into that. I think it's more common that something ends up with too much intake. Your transfers pretty much dictate where you make your power. If you raise them too high, I think it does about the same as having too much intake, because between these two you have crankcase compression. You typically are aiming from anywhere like 35 to 45 degrees. And this is a huge generalization because I'm just covering like a whole range of numbers that I've seen and stuff. It's anywhere from like 35 to 45 degrees. And that number, I think that relates more to throttle response and kind of where you make power, because some stuff, if it's got real low compression numbers, it'll still run way up high in RPM range, but we're not talking about that right now. That's still more advanced stuff. This is just a range here, and yeah, if you have too much intake or too little crankcase compression, I think it does the same thing where you have a delayed throttle response. Transfers pretty much controls where your power is made, and like what your power curve is going to look like. And I've seen them as high as 115 degrees and as low as 132. If you have high transfers, that's a high open duration, and you're going to make power high in RPM range. Low transfers, low duration, you're going to make power more in the low RPM range. Exhaust, I think, is really, really important. I know it's really, really important because I've ran the same build or the same saw with a high exhaust roof and a low exhaust roof. It really affects torque a lot, especially in the smaller saws. Most of them from the factory, I don't think have a low enough exhaust. Some of them are too low. Some of them are not low enough. Echo 4910 is 109 opens at 109 degrees stock. A Steel MS 261 opens at like 99 degrees or 100 degrees. Again, two different animals, but that's just a range of where I've seen them. It's more important to pick your exhaust based on the motor size. So that's where I said, 50cc saw, your exhaust is probably going to run anywhere from 101 to 109. 105-ish is a pretty good number, because the lower your exhaust, the longer the piston is under pressure from the combustion cycle, the longer your power stroke. Lower exhaust typically gives you more torque because you're having a longer power stroke, and it's going to control your RPM. Your free rev RPM is going to drop. Now, just because your free rev RPM drop doesn't mean your cut RPM is going to drop. Sometimes that goes up because the power stroke, where you're making power is in your cut speed, or around the same RPMs that you're cutting, so sometimes it jumps up. It's real common in a 50cc saw to run a lower roof and gain cut speed. But between your transverse and your exhaust, you have your blowdown. I don't pay much attention to blowdown, and I haven't in a while. Everyone talks about it, but I think that's just because that's the first term they know or they learn going into two-stroke tuning. They'll say, oh yeah, I have 12 degrees of blowdown, I have 22, 25, 30, whatever. It ranges all over the place. And that's where we're talking about how you approach your numbers. Some people just pick all three, time it in durations. I think that's probably the best way to go, the best way to look at them. Some people time them by blowdown, pick an exhaust number, and set your transfers based on the degrees of blowdown you want. Some people do an excellent job with that. Doesn't work for everybody. And you do the same thing with crankcase compression. You could say, okay, my intake opens here, I want 45 degrees crankcase compression, and then you open your transfers. I think these two have drawbacks. This one doesn't really have drawbacks once you have started to look at things in duration. If you don't want to try and convert everything to durations, just remember 1 degree change on any of these numbers is 2 degrees in your total duration. The engine spins 360 degrees. The only time you're talking about 360 degrees is with your intake or with your total durations. If you sticking between 0 and 180 is just easier for me. Just keep in mind, if you move that intake to 75, you're going to say, oh, I only gained 3 degrees duration. No, you actually gained 6. That's just how it works. Let's see. Another thing to keep in mind, all your cylinders are gonna like similar numbers. Well, I take that back. All your cylinders are gonna like numbers that are a little bit different. A lot of it depends on, what you're given to work with as far as available space to raise your transfer ports, available space to machine the base. um, available area of the port. That's a real big one on the exhaust. Some of them you can't go very wide, so the only way to get more port area is by going up. Well, going up also increases duration, so that's going to change the way it runs a lot. Trying to think what else I could try to explain. So I think I'm going to pull up one of Dyno Joe's graphs because it makes a lot more sense to me to look at something, look at how it's actually changing versus talking about it on paper. Because I can show you these numbers and essentially how it's all working out. Yeah, I forgot. I went on a tangent. But yeah, all your cylinders are going to time a little differently. Like this weird 6-port Echo cylinder, it's really like a quad port with an extra hole in the top. You have transfer caps, you don't have as much room to work, so you have to set this cylinder up differently. This big old quad dual port steel cylinder, yeah, there's a few things you can do differently here. You probably have a lot more room to go up with your transfers. Exhaust width is going to be a little bit different. That's more related to pistons, but we'll stick with this for now. One exception. There's always so there's going to be an exception to some kind of rule. That's why you can't have all this set in stone. So there's going to be an exception to every rule you try and make. Like if you have a reed intake, you can run. You can totally ignore your intake timing because the reeds are acting as your valve. In a piston ported cylinder, the piston acts as the valve. Strato cylinders typically have a really tiny intake, so they can run higher duration intakes because you have to flow more air through a smaller hole or air fuel mix, and then a lot of times they can run really high transfer durations as well because the way that the transfer is filled is it's filled with air from the top and then air fuel mix from the bottom. So you're just sending a shot of air through the cylinder or through the combustion chamber before you get any air fuel mix. It's the scavenge exhaust. So it's essentially acting like, if you want to look at blowdown, it's essentially acting like it has a longer blowdown. Really when you have too little blowdown, that causes reversion, but you have to really try, I think, because a Husqvarna 262 has like 12 or 13 degrees of blowdown stock. That's not a whole lot of timing there. So in that situation, I don't think those saws had reversion issues, but it's just just a note. You can squeeze your blowdown numbers pretty tight and still have something that runs good. I think the new Husqvarna's, like the Strato saw design, is going to squeeze it down even more. So some of the new Husqvarnas can operate with like single degrees. I think I've heard as low as 7. And then conventional cylinders I've heard as far as like 32 or 34, something like that. And I've seen, either you can find videos of saws that run good at both ends of the spectrum. So yeah, now I'm going to show you the Dyno Joe graph. Alright, so what I really wanted to show was this is a real good way to explain how port durations change power curves. Here's your stock, where your stock saw makes peak power. The way you get them way up there is pretty much by adding compression. That's going to change your peak power. Where you make that peak power is pretty much dictated by your transfer duration. So if you wanted to make it further back, then you need less transfer duration than wherever your starting point was. If you want to make your peak power further forward, typically you're going to add more transfer duration. Now, that'll change, that can make power drop off. If you add more, it's a balance in finding what works best for you. Some people may want something that makes a ton of power way out here, nothing further down. Some people may want something that makes all the power down low, and they're not really concerned about high-end power. You're going to cut slower that way, but you can probably lean on the saw and not bog it down. I think that's what I wanted to. Oh, and your exhaust roof, if you raise it, your peak RPM raises, so exhaust roof kind of makes it go out. When you raise it, transfer duration changes where your peak is at. So exhaust duration changes curve length, total RPM range. Transfer duration changes your peak range. Compression is going to raise it up, and then you just have to have your intake set. Pretty much you want your intake set at the bare minimum to feed your saw or feed the engine. If you have it too much, then it's going to dip way down here, and you may gain a little bit at the top end, but typically keeping your intake duration as low as you can with the rest of the motor is ideal. But that's my shot at port durations and times. I think I'm gonna make an email address. If you're a beginner, you have questions, feel free to email me. I'll do my best to check it, answer questions on it. Otherwise, you can leave them in the comments. I'm pretty active in the comments, so hope y'all gained something out of that. If not, ask me a more specific question and I'll do my best to answer it.